1400 years ago, a humble merchant who could not read or write changed the face of Arabia. His name was Muhammad. Today, his influence has spread to every corner of the world, including the United States. He was neither tall and lanky, nor short and heavy-set. When he looked at someone, he looked them in the eyes. He was the most generous-hearted of men, the most truthful of them in speech, the most mild-tempered of them, and the noblest of them in lineage. Anyone who would describe him would say, "I never saw before or after him the like of him." Muhammad, described by a contemporary.
Muhammad was a man who faced an absolutely hopeless situation. There was a whole continent, virtually, of people killing one another in an endless, hopeless vendetta, going down a chute of violence and warfare, feeling that society was coming to an end and had no hope. He gave them hope, single-handedly. In a space of 23 years, he brought peace and new hope to Arabia and a new beacon for the world.
Islam, the religion Muhammad first brought to Arabia, now claims 1.2 billion followers around the world. There are an estimated 7 million Muslims in America, where it is the country's fastest growing religion and the most diverse.
Like America itself, the Muslims in this country come from all over the world. They have a common bond, not only in their religious faith and in their mosques, but in this story of Muhammad. They all look to it. This is the source of how to behave, of how to be a constructive citizen, of how to be a good parent, of how to be a good child, of how to seek knowledge and truth. These are values that are expressed most clearly for Muslims in the story of Muhammad.
Through the stories about Prophet Muhammad, we were able to make connections, and all of a sudden you would feel that you could relate to things that happened 1,500 years ago, and that the issues weren't old-fashioned, they were universal. And that's what he's taught me.
This is the story Muslims have passed down from generation to generation for 1,400 years. A story about the merchant, husband, father, statesman, and warrior whom they consider the final prophet. The man whose legacy continues to shape their lives today.
The life of Muhammad is, even in its details, probably better known than any other major religious figure before modern times. His followers made careful efforts to record memories that they had of things that he had said and things that he had done. Many of these traditions may have been made up later on, but at the core, there seems to me to be little reason to doubt that there is a picture and a portrait of a living man.
According to Muslim sources, Muhammad bin Abdullah, or son of Abdullah, was born in the year 570 in the city of Mecca in what is today Saudi Arabia. A poet of the times described Mecca as a place where winter and summer were equally intolerable. The world into which Muhammad arrived was a brutal one, defined by hunger, violence, and tribal warfare.
You could not exist without your tribe. An individual in this dangerous world had absolutely no chance of survival. And that meant that the tribe had become perhaps the most sacred value in Arabia.
It's a society that's based on the idea of vigilantism, that if somebody attacked my clan, then I have a right to go and attack anyone from his clan. They saw justice as taking revenge.
The Arabs of the 6th century had no written code of law, no common religion, and no central government. In this dangerous world, Muhammad had the good fortune to be born into Mecca's powerful tribe, the Quraysh. But his father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was only 6. His uncle, Abu Talib, was left to raise the young orphan.
He surely had to have worried about his future, what will he be? And so he must have been a very introspective child. Muhammad had the habit of going out in the desert and contemplating the stars and thinking about why he was an orphan and how would life be to him in the future.
Orphans were marginal people, and he felt very, very strongly identified with the poor and disadvantaged for the rest of his life.
The Mecca of Muhammad's youth was both a religious and a commercial center, located at the crossroads of 2 major trading routes. Pilgrims came from all over Arabia to worship the hundreds of idols that surrounded the Kaaba, an ancient shrine in the heart of the city. The Kaaba was surrounded by a sacred area where fighting was not allowed. The commerce generated by the pilgrims made it possible for a young man in Muhammad's circumstances to make a living in the markets of Mecca. Soon, Muhammad began acting as an agent for wealthy merchants, taking their goods on caravans throughout Arabia. These journeys exposed him to a variety of other tribes and communities and a range of new ideas.
He probably learned the differences that exist between different tribes, people speaking different languages. He encountered Christians and Jews and learned from them what their faith, what their religion, what their cultures are.
Muhammad would have become aware that for the Jews and the Christians, the Holy Scripture was very important. Both got scriptures in which God had sent a sacred message to prophets, and this was a way in which people could relate to the divine. When Muhammad was about 25 years old, he had a major change in his life. A wealthy widow, older woman named Khadija, asked him to take her caravans into Syria for her.
Muhammad took all her goods and went with the caravan to Syria and did an incredible job. And her respect for him turned into admiration for him, and she inquired about him through one of her friends.
Shortly thereafter, Khadija asked Muhammad to marry her. "I like you because of our relationship," she said, "and your high reputation among your people, your trustworthiness, good character, and truthfulness."
And this is interesting because she's a very beautiful woman, but she's 40. She's moving into her maturity, and he's a 25-year-old youth. He's an orphan, and He accepts this proposal, and it's arranged through the family, and he does indeed marry her.
And people have often said, rather sneeringly, that this was just a marriage of convenience on his part. He'd just married the wealthy widow for his own gain and profit. But there's no doubt in my mind that he deeply, deeply loved Khadija.
Over the course of their marriage, Khadija and Muhammad had 4 daughters and 2 sons who died as infants. He was a family man and a successful and respected merchant. But as Muhammad approached his own 40th birthday, he was becoming increasingly restless and troubled by the problems of Meccan society.
Within a few generations, they had gone from this kind of brutal existence in the Arabian steppes to becoming financiers, bankers, businessmen, merchants with a lot of money. And this was great, of course, and people were delighted, but it was a very disturbing time because the market economy demanded, as we know only too well in the West, a strong competitive streak. People no longer felt that they had to take care of the poor and the needy and the weaker members of Quraysh any longer. They had to make as much money as they possibly could.
They had a marvelous society. They had a trading town. They were booming. They were doing business. They were living like an affluent society. And when you have an affluent society, the tendency is to become hedonistic, to look at, what are the pleasures of life?
Muhammad would often retreat to the mountains outside Mecca to meditate. It was on one such retreat in the year 610 that Muhammad had an experience that would transform history.
The Prophet used to retire from time to time into a hill called Jabal al-Nur, the mountain of light. When you climb up that mountain, and many people still do it, on top of it is a cave called Al-Hira in Arabic, into which the Prophet would oftentimes retire in order to contemplate and to pray and to be still with God. The coming of the revelation was an immediate act. The descent from heaven came suddenly.
Muhammad was woken from sleep and felt himself absolutely enveloped by a terrifying divine presence. He says it's an angel that seemed to squeeze him in a devastating embrace, and it felt as though all the breath was being squeezed out of his body, and a voice said to him, "Recite." And Muhammad said, "No, I am not a reciter." The voice again said, "Recite. Recite." And then squeezed, as he said, almost beyond his endurance, Muhammad felt the first inspired words of a new scripture in Arabic pouring from his lips.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. That is, recite in the name of thy Lord who created.
And Islam had come into being.
And the Prophet, of course, having received the divine word, began to tremble and tremendous fear, because there's no common ground between the human reality and the divine reality. He ran out of the cave. When he ran out of the cave, he looked back, and the archangel filled up the whole of the sky.
Everywhere you looked, there was Gabriel. Not just a single angelic image, but a presence, a being, a power. This is how the ineffable, incomprehensible, utterly transcendent, indescribable God makes itself known to us.
This was something that really shook him to the very core of his being. And he goes down from that mountain and he is shaking. And I think it's shock. Here's somebody who's gone looking for this transcendent reality, and this transcendent reality is now replying.
Muhammad was so shaken by this experience, he feared he might be possessed. He ran home directly to Khadija.
And there he flung himself into her lap, and he said, cover me, hold me, until the terror had passed. Khadija was the person who reassured him. He said, have I become a kahin, a soothsayer? And she said, no, my dear, this is not what God does. This revelation comes from God.
The message Muhammad received on the Mountain of Light was simple. He was to recite the words of the one true God. But Muhammad still had doubts that his experience was genuine.
Khadija thought it would be a good idea to go to consult her cousin, Waraka, who was a Christian.
She's saying, we need to go to somebody that knows about these things. Because if you're told you're being given a message from God, well, there have been previous messages. So let's go ask Waraka, who knows the scripture. He knows the Torah and the gospel.
And as soon as Waraka heard about this, he immediately said, Muhammad is the prophet who will bring the revelation of the one God to the Arabs. And he warned Muhammad that he would have a really rough time.
He says, your people are going to reject you and they will chase you out of this city. This has never come to any human being except they were persecuted, because this is basically undermining the paradigm.
And after a while, Muhammad began to realize that the messages he was receiving fit a pattern that he knew about from Jewish and Christian tradition as well, and that is that there are such things as prophets. There are people who receive messages from the divine, and that he began to realize that indeed he was one of them as well.
When we think of prophecy, we come from a tradition in America where we think of Charlton Heston, you know, with a great big beard, and the wind's always blowing, and he's wearing raggedy clothes, and they're ranting people, you know, they're ranting, raving. In the Islamic view, a prophet isn't this kind of person at all, but it's a person who has been selected very reluctantly from his people. God selected them, and they couldn't get out of the clutches in the sense they had to do it.
You have to think in terms of a tribal Bedouin society. What is the worst thing that could happen to somebody? It is not death. It is shame. And so I'm sure that in his own mind, the idea of being shamed was probably very important. I mean, think of the double loss of face. You know, he's going to lose face, he's going to be shamed in front of his people, and he's going to be shamed in front of Allah who gave him that message.
The message Muhammad had received from God revealed that his people would be held accountable in the next life for their behavior in this one. Although Muhammad was initially reluctant to tell others about his experience, a new revelation commanded him to make his message public.
So he calls all of his family members together and he says, what would you say if I told you that there was this army waiting to attack us on the other side of that hill? They said, we would believe you. And he said, what would you say if I told you I'm a messenger from God? I think it's absurd. You called us together for this? And he says, will no one support me in this? And the only person is a child, Ali, who's his cousin, gets up and says, I will support you. And they think this is hilarious, that this is who's going to follow this prophet is a child.
Think about it. There's a man, a middle-aged man, who doesn't know how to read or write, who has no wealth, who is an orphan. Yes, he is from a very important tribe, but he works for a woman. And he now says, I'm the prophet. God has spoken to me. This is not going to fly.
The divine message that Muhammad brought to his fellow Meccans carried with it a sharp warning for their increasingly materialistic society.
He was coming to warn the people of Mecca and the surrounding countryside and his own tribe of Quraysh that unless they pulled themselves together and started creating a more just and decent society, restoring the old tribal values of looking after the poor, the orphan, the widow, the oppressed, then there was going to be a terrible catastrophe.
The Arabs did not believe in afterlife. They really thought that life ended with death, and there was no resurrection, there was no coming back, there was no reincarnation.
So now Muhammad is saying, you know that one God we spoke of? When you're going to die, you don't just disappear, but you're going to be accountable to that God for the good deeds and the bad deeds.
He was bringing a moral, ethical, social message to his people that we're all in the same boat before God and we must treat each other well with compassion and justice and equity.
The revelation Muhammad received on the Mountain of Light was only the first of many that he would continue to receive for the rest of his life.
The revelation does not come in a lump sum. It doesn't just come down from heaven, here's the book, now go out and teach it to the people. No. It is coming down slowly. It's coming down as events unfold. And it's explaining the events, but it's also coming down in a way that he can absorb it. Because the idea is that this thing is so tremendous, this thing is so immense, that it's not something that we can give you all at once. This is going to take time.
He used to say that I never once experienced a revelation without feeling that my soul had been torn from my body.
The Prophet could be sitting, he could be on horseback, he could be walking, he could be talking, but he was suddenly seized by the divine word.
He would feel a great weight descend upon him. He would sweat profusely, even on a cold day. Sometimes, he said, it would be like the reverberations of a bell. And that, he said, is hardest for me. It's not the words that were coming, but he'd have to listen very hard for the meaning of what communication, divine communication, was coming through.
After Muhammad received each revelation, he would recite it to the people who were with him, and they would pass it on to the community.
When the Prophet, who did not know how to read and write, started revealing the words of the Quran, they acquired credibility because of the very nature of the words spoken. People would look at it and say, my goodness, this cannot be the words of a man. He could not have made this up.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم.
The Quran is the most extraordinarily beautiful discourse. It doesn't come over in translation, but the Arabic is extraordinary. When the first Muslims heard the Quran, many of them were converted to the Prophet's message, not necessarily because of its content, but because of its beauty.
That revelation was presented in a society where there were people who were professional memorizers. They could hear something recited once and they could repeat it. The recitation then by Muhammad was carefully preserved immediately in the minds of memorizers and in the minds of people who were able to write down notes. What we now call the Quran represented the complete collection of those words that Muhammad recited when he said, "This is the revelation of God."
All we have of the Prophet And all we have of the Word of God is actually words. We don't have any pictures. We don't have any statues. All we have left is words. We can take those words, and through the art of calligraphy, we can make them more vivid, more accessible.
For Muhammad Zakaria, words are the basis of an art form. To prevent idolatry, Muhammad discouraged the creation of any images of himself or other prophets. Calligraphy eventually became Islam's highest art form. Among the sacred texts that Zakaria writes is the Hilya, a portrait of the Prophet in words.
Transmitted from Ali, who, when asked to describe the Prophet, would say, "His face was not narrow, nor was it fully round, but there was a little bit of roundness to it. When he looked at someone, he looked at them with his face turned perfectly towards them. Whoever saw him unexpectedly was in awe of him, and whoever associated with him familiarly loved him. Anyone who would describe him would say, 'I never saw before him or after him the like of him. Peace be upon him.'" That's the most famous of the Hilyas. It gives you a description of the qualities of a person so that you can almost see them in your eyes, in your mind's eye. I like to think it's like having a little memento of the Prophet near you so that you can look at it and think of it now and then. And, of course, he's not with us, but the Hilya brings him his presence a little closer.
Muhammad was always very insistent that he was not a divine figure, and he always warned his followers not to do with him what the Christians had done to Jesus and put him on a pedestal and say that he was God or divine. He was not. He was an ordinary human being, and the Muslims have taken that seriously. But what they do say is that Muhammad is the perfect man. That if you look at Muhammad, you can see how a perfect act of surrender to the divine can be made.
Muhammad's message slowly began to attract followers, especially among the downtrodden and the oppressed within Meccan society.
It's really the people that don't have anything to lose and everything to gain. They're the ones that are responding to this message. Many of the followers are poor people, slaves, women that don't have protectors. It's spreading amongst the disenfranchised of Mecca.
Prophet Muhammad noticed that he lives in a society that downgrades women. They were viewed as second-hand citizens, an object or personal belongings that belong to the man. And that disturbed the Prophet.
Early in his prophetic career, Muhammad condemned female infanticide. Later revelations would give women legal rights in marriage, allow them to divorce, and protect their inheritance rights.
Of course, it's absurd and anachronistic to expect Muhammad to be a feminist in the 21st century sense. But nevertheless, what he did for women in the context of his time was amazing.
Although most women were second-class citizens in pre-Islamic Arabia, Muhammad's own wife, Khadija, was wealthy and powerful.
There's been this idea that women prior to Islam were chattel, that they had no rights. And I think that for many, many levels of the women, that is true. But for a certain level of woman, which Khadija would have been amongst, that is not true.
Khadija is an inspiration because in spite of the male-dominated society that she lived in, she was a working woman. And so there are some parallels for modern women to learn from her example.
In Mecca, opposition to Muhammad was growing. His message of monotheism and his campaign against idolatry threatened the lucrative trade that fueled the Meccan economy.
The business of Mecca is to draw pilgrims to Mecca. They want to make money. And the way they draw pilgrims to Mecca is people come visit their gods. Well, here's somebody who's saying, these gods, they're not real. They're stones. They're rocks. You're wasting your time. Now, that message has economic implications to the Quraysh. They're worried. This man is going to undermine our business.
In the tribal system, Muhammad was protected by his uncle, Abu Talib. So the Meccans went to Abu Talib and asked him to turn Muhammad over to them.
Abu Talib was in a difficult position. He was not a Muslim. But it went against the grain for him to simply hand over his beloved nephew to these people who would kill him with impunity. So he took Muhammad to one side and said, look, don't do this. Don't do this to us. Can't you just keep quiet?
And at that point, the Prophet says, if they put the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left hand, I will not stop preaching what I am preaching until this message is conveyed or I die conveying it. And this is what he tells his uncle. And at that point, he begins to weep. And his uncle looks at him and realizes the depth of the conviction of this man. And he says, say whatever you want. You have my protection.
The first Muslims faced a torrent of ridicule and abuse when they practiced Islam in public. Attacked by crowds throwing stones, they retreated to the surrounding mountains to pray in secret. Many pagan families split apart when their children converted to Islam. Finally, the leaders of Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh, decided that harassment alone would not be enough to stop him.
The Quraysh, they see it as, our honor is being threatened, we need to deal with this. This is the point where they begin to really increase their persecution. They start sanctions on the house of Bani Hashim, which is the sub-clan of the Prophet Muhammad. They begin sanctions, they begin to prevent them from trading, from transacting.
And that meant that basically they were being starved out. They couldn't buy food, they couldn't do business. Abu Talib was ruined by this. The Hashim lived in one street, and Muhammad and Khadija and the children moved into this street. And this became a little Muslim ghetto.
And this leads to real hardship. There's a period of time where, according to the tradition, they're actually eating from the leaves of trees.
Famine destroyed the fortunes of Muhammad's protector Abu Talib and his follower Abu Bakr. The survival of both the clan and Islam were in jeopardy. But for Muhammad, the damage hit even closer to home.
Khadija, Muhammad's beloved wife, perhaps weakened by the privations, actually died. And that was just a crippling blow for him. Left him feeling alone and vulnerable and weak. He would miss her all his life, I think. Then the catastrophe happened that Abu Talib died, perhaps himself weakened by the deprivation in food. Now, without Abu Talib, Muhammad was fair game for assassination. And there's a terrible moment where he utters this heartbreaking prayer, saying, "Oh my God, I have no other protector but you, Allah." And how was he going to move forward? He'd done what Allah had told him to do. He'd proclaimed this message, and all he seemed to have done was stir up hostility and hatred, and split his tribe down the middle. This wasn't improving matters. He must have felt in almost a sort of a dark night of the soul.
He is at the low point of his mission. He's been almost 13 years now in Mecca, and the results are not impressive. But at this point, at this low ebb, he is now being prepared for the most extraordinary mystical experience of his prophetic life, and that is what is known as the night ascension.
The story goes that one night he was sleeping near the Kaaba, and he was woken from sleep by Gabriel, who mounted him on a burak, a magical steed, and they flew from Mecca to Jerusalem. And then he began an ascent up through the seven heavens to the divine throne. At every stage of the heavens, he meets various prophets of the past. He meets Abraham, he meets Jesus and John the Baptist, he meets Moses. And finally, he enters into the divine presence, and there the sources are silent, because when you enter into the presence of God, you've gone beyond words.
And he receives from God the highest form of knowledge and truth, and many injunctions of the religion itself, including the final form of the daily prayers. Now, all of this took place in a time beyond time. That's why some sources say that as the door was swinging when he left, he was still swinging when he came back.
For later Muslims, this also meant that the departure point, that is, Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock, became also important. Muslims say that there are three holy cities in Islam: Mecca, and Medina, the city of the Prophet, and Jerusalem.
When he comes back, somebody asks him, what have you been doing? And he says, I went to Jerusalem last night. And this man says, you went to Jerusalem last night? Are you willing to say that publicly? So they assemble this group and they tell him, describe for us Jerusalem. And he begins to describe it in very exact detail. And they're shocked. They don't know what to make of this now.
The story of the night journey not only incited Muhammad's enemies, it caused doubt even among some of his followers.
This is something they hadn't really expected. A journey that takes them a month to be made in an evening and to come back. What Abu Bakr says is, listen, I believe that he's getting messages from God. That is certainly more extraordinary than making a night journey to Jerusalem.
As Muhammad's relationship with the Meccans continued to deteriorate, his enemies decided that the time had come to eliminate him.
And they decide to get a youth from each clan. They all come together and they're going to strike him with one blow together. So the blood is distributed amongst all the clans.
Under cover of darkness, the assassins surrounded Muhammad's home. Inside, a covered figure lay asleep. As dawn broke, they prepared to strike. But Muhammad had been forewarned about the plot. He asked his cousin Ali, whom he knew the Quraysh would not harm, to take his place. By the time the assassins burst into his home, Muhammad and his companion Abu Bakr had escaped into the desert. With the Meccans in hot pursuit, they set out on a circuitous route to the oasis settlement of Yathrib, 250 miles to the north. For several months, Muhammad had been sending his followers there for refuge. Now, he was about to join them.
Yathrib was quite different from Mecca. It was an agricultural settlement. People grew dates and they had farms, and there were a number of clans and tribes living together in the settlement. The settlement was engulfed in tribal warfare of the worst kind. It was an example of where the whole system in Arabia was beginning to break down. One killing led to another, and nobody could seem to find a solution.
Nobody, that is, until the clans of Yathrib heard about the trustworthy Muhammad, hoping he could unify its warring factions, which included two major pagan tribes and their Jewish allies. A delegation from Yathrib had taken the dramatic step of inviting Muhammad to move to their settlement.
The deal is that he will serve as their binding arbitrator. That is, both sides to the conflict have agreed already that they will accept the arbitration of Muhammad, whatever it would be.
The people of Yathrib vowed that they would take the Muslims on board as honorary tribesmen. They would be their protectors. Anyone who hurt the Muslims, they would retaliate, and the Muslims agreed to do the same. This move from your tribe to join up with people who were of no kin to you at all was absolutely unheard of. Muhammad was really going off into the wilderness here. He was breaking every tie, doing something utterly shocking and novel.
When Prophet Muhammad was leaving, he stood up on a hill, and he was looking on Mecca, and his tears were coming down of his eyes, and he talked to Mecca and he said, God knows that I love you, Mecca, so much, but it is your people who are chasing me out.
In Yathrib, Muhammad's followers anxiously awaited the Prophet's arrival. Had the man they hoped would save them been able to save himself? Had the Meccans captured or even killed him? When Muhammad finally reached the outskirts of the city, his relieved followers rushed to greet him with a song Muslims around the world still sing 1,400 years later. Muhammad's arrival marked the beginning of a dramatic new chapter in the history of Islam. For the first time, he would be the leader of a sovereign community based on Islamic law. Yathrib would henceforth become known as Medina.
Muhammad arrives in Medina as somebody who's escaping danger. He's been invited there, but he doesn't know what to expect. So at each stage of his life, there's a new challenge, and obviously new fears and new doubts. And so he started thinking in terms of policy, in terms of strategy, in terms of tactics. And that's what ultimately made him into a statesman, because that's what statesmen do.
Now, unlike Jesus or the Buddha, who seem to have been purely spiritual leaders with no temporal responsibilities whatever, Muhammad found himself now head of state, having transferred the Muslim families from Mecca to Medina. He now had to make sure they could survive there.
The survival of the fledgling community depended on its ability to defend itself against attacks from Mecca. To respond to this possibility, Muhammad developed a novel political solution.
He essentially establishes a pact, an agreement. Sometimes it's called the Constitution of Medina. Whether you were a pagan or a Muslim, or a member of the Jewish tribes or any other tribes in Medina, you had to sign on to this pact. And the pact established that if there were ever an attack on Medina from the outside, all the inhabitants of the town would be responsible to defend the city. This way, Muhammad really developed a revolutionary idea, which was transcend your tribal responsibilities, your petty particularism, and begin to think in larger terms as an entire community.
Now, this was a very fearful, terrifying time for Muslims, but nevertheless, it was seen as a time when the faith was at its strongest. It's a creative act for Muslims to look back at the Muslim community in Medina and try to apply the ideals to their own society so that they can reproduce something of the Prophet's original spirit.
Helper.
When Muhammad arrived in Medina, he made it clear that helping immigrants would be one of the cornerstones of the new Islamic society.
This is his message. Spread peace, feed people food, and do some devotional practice, and you'll enter paradise without any trouble. 2/3 of that message is about other people. The secret of Medina is it's a place where human beings are going to attempt to live up to the ideal of the Islamic tradition.
Part of the arrangement was that the people of Medina agreed that they would provide housing and support for the immigrants as they came in. And very often they were even paired, so that certain people had direct responsibility for specific people from Mecca.
And that did not take place in 24 hours. It came step by step, and within a few months, you now had two groups. The helpers, so-called Al-Ansar, that is those Medinan Arabs who had become Muslims, and the Meccans who had become Muslims before them. And in this way, for the first time, you created the Islamic Ummah, that is, the Islamic people, that bond which transcends all other bonds.
He said to these people, these are now your neighbors, these are your brothers and sisters. He establishes that sense of humanity, that ummah. We are all connected to one another. We are all responsible for one another.
It was at the mosque that Muhammad discussed a sweeping change in policy with his followers. After years of exercising restraint in the face of persecution by the Meccans, Muhammad received a clear new revelation that marked a dramatic departure from the past. It gave the Muslims limited permission to take up arms in self-defense. The statesman was about to become a general.
For 13 years, there's been no sanction to fight. Then a revelation comes that says, those who have been removed unjustly from their homes and have been fought because of their religious beliefs are sanctioned to fight, to defend themselves.
Killing is always abhorrent. The Quran makes it very clear about that. And the Quran says that it's always wrong to start a war, to be an aggressor. But persecution is worse than killing. When people have been driven from their homes or deprived of their basic human rights, or when an evil ideology comes into the world, sometimes, regrettably, it may be necessary to fight, and sometimes lives will be lost.
Muhammad's first large military engagement occurred near the town of Badr, when 313 Muslims set out to surprise a caravan from Muhammad's own tribe, the Quraysh.
In a sense, the Battle of Badr, which became such a landmark in Muslim history, was a sort of mistake. The Muslims had planned a conventional raid, but the Meccans, when they heard that this band of renegades was attacking their great caravan, were so enraged they sent out the whole army against them. And the Muslims were convinced that they were going to die.
He never wanted to fight the Meccans. I mean, the Meccans are his people, his friends, his family. He wants to co-opt them. He wants to make them the key, if you will, to the new Islamic Ummah that he's trying to form. So he doesn't want to go to war with them.
As he prepared to lead the Muslims into battle, Muhammad took the unprecedented step of establishing clear rules of engagement for his army.
He makes it very clear to his soldiers that if they have the right to use force against the Qurayshis, that does not mean that they will do the same thing that has been done in pre-Islamic wars, in which women and children could be killed, in which no prisoners could be taken, no quarter given. No. He said Islam is a religion of law.
The Meccans had sent an army of about 1,000 men. As the army approached, Muhammad prepared to make a stand near a well. One of his soldiers suddenly questioned his strategy. "Has God revealed it to you," he asked, "or is it your own opinion?" When Muhammad answered that he was speaking as a man, not a prophet, the soldier suggested that they stop at a larger well closer to the enemy so they could deprive them of water. Muhammad agreed at once. The change in strategy proved decisive, and the Muslims recorded a resounding triumph.
It was a victory that stunned the Muslims. It seemed like a complete reversal, like a miracle, almost a sort of revelation of God in history. A furqan, they called it, something that separated the just from the unjust.
After the battle, Muhammad received a revelation claiming the victory for God. The Muslims felt that angels had been fighting alongside them. The victory reaffirmed their belief that God was on their side and raised Muhammad's status higher still. But his followers also knew that the Meccans would seek violent retribution. A year later, an army of 3,000 Meccans returned to face 1,000 Muslims in the Battle of Uhud. The resulting rout left the future of Islam in mortal peril.
It was a horrible battle, and the corpses of the Muslims were mutilated by the Meccans, and the Meccan women, as was their wont, came out onto the battlefield and danced around the corpses.
Many of Muhammad's soldiers lost their lives in the battle, including a rabbi who had honored the Medina Pact by fighting alongside Muhammad. The families of the fallen Muslims were now without protectors. Then, Muhammad received a new revelation, allowing Muslim men to safeguard these women and children by taking as many as 4 wives, but only if they could treat them equally.
That in itself, in the context of Arabia, was a bit of a restriction, because a man could have unlimited number of wives. The context of the permission to polygamy is to say who is going to look after these women. And it was an act of faith, not an act of lust, that inspired men to take more wives. So it would be wrong to think of the Prophet as basking decadently in a garden of sensual delights with his harem. His harem was very much a matter of state, and sometimes his wives were rather a mixed blessing.
Although Muhammad was monogamous during Khadija's life, after her death, he eventually married a number of women, including one of the Uhud widows, Salama.
The reason for his marriages were really political alliances. It was a tribal society, and for Muhammad to marry into another tribe and to take a wife just meant that there was a bond being created with this tribe.
Among Muhammad's wives were the daughters of his 2 closest allies, Abu Bakr and Omar. Abu Bakr's daughter, Aisha, would become one of the most influential women in his life.
Aisha was very lively. She was brilliant. She was somebody that questioned the Prophet. She was not somebody in any way that took everything. She questioned him. She said, "What does that mean? Why did you do this? Why did you do that?" She was somebody that really had an incredibly active mind. She memorized vast amounts of prophetic traditions, and she's considered to be actually the transmitter of a large number of traditions from the Prophet Muhammad.
In the year that followed the Battle of Uhud, the Meccans girded themselves for a final assault that they hoped would finish off the Muslims once and for all. They assembled one of the largest armies ever seen in Arabia and marched on Medina. But Muhammad hit upon a daring defense.
Muhammad has dug a trench around the whole of the settlement. And you have an almost comic scene with the Meccan cavalry galloping up to this trench and pulling back in horror and saying, "What is this?" They've never seen anything so unsporting in their lives. This is something, they say, the Arabs don't do. It sounds comical, but surrounded by the powerful Meccan army, the Muslims were expecting all to be killed, to a man, to a woman.
Stopped by the trench around Medina, the Meccans laid siege to the city and to the hundreds of Muslim families trapped inside. According to Muslim sources, in their determination to defeat Muhammad, the Meccans had recruited as allies many Bedouin tribes, as well as the largest Jewish tribe within Medina, the Bani Qurayza. For the Muslims, this defection was the final blow in a relationship that had been strained from the beginning.
When Muhammad came to town, the organized Jewish community did not accept his prophecy. There were, according to the Islamic sources, some individual Jews that did accept him. But for the most part, the community as a whole did not. If the Jews would accept his prophethood, then he has tremendous and complete confirmation of his prophethood. But the Jews were so well respected that when they rejected his prophethood, and they did it actively, they became a very serious political threat to his very existence in Medina.
Despite the aid of the Bani Qurayza, the Meccan siege could not break through the Muslim defenses. When the weather turned bad, the Bedouin tribes began deserting the field of battle. The Meccans themselves lost heart and departed, abandoning their Jewish allies to be tried by the Muslims for the crime of treason.
Islamic sources believe that the Jews did indeed aid the enemy in trying to defeat Muhammad. This was absolutely against the terms of the Medina Agreement. The Jews and the Muslims decided that they would choose an arbitrator to determine what would be the future of the Jews. The person who was chosen was a man who was mortally wounded in the Battle of the Trench. And so he determined that the women and children of the Banu Qurayza would be taken as slaves to the Muslims, and the men would be killed.
The Prophet agreed with this judgment. When he judged, he said that you have judged according to God and his messenger. And then approximately 700 men were killed. They were executed. So this definitely occurred.
All that can be said is that this cannot be seen as anti-Semitism per se. Muhammad had nothing against the Jewish people per se or the Jewish religion. The Quran continues to tell Muslims to honor the people of the book and to honor their religion as authentic. And the Jewish tribes who had not rebelled, who had not given help to the Meccans, continued to live in Medina completely unmolested. Muhammad was not trying to exterminate Jews. He was trying to get rid of very dangerous internal enemies.
It's unfortunate that many historians, and particularly in contemporary times, both on the Jewish and on the Muslim side, have transformed this. On the Jewish side, they have used that as a way of saying, well, you see, Muslims hate the Jews and they kill them. And on the Muslim side, it says, well, you see, the Jews are full of treachery and can't be trusted. Both are wrong.
When the other tribes of the peninsula saw the impotence of Mecca with all its power and might against this little community, they began to switch allegiance and see that Muhammad was the coming man. Now, once that happened, once the tide had been turned after the Battle of the Trench, and the Muslims were no longer subject to the fear of extermination, Muhammad stopped the fighting.
The Prophet Muhammad received a few people, militants, who just arrived from one of the battles that they came back from, and they felt so important. We finished this job fighting with the enemies of Islam. And the Prophet smiled and he said, let me tell you something. You finished the minor jihad, and now you have the bigger jihad ahead of you. And they were stunned. They thought that they just finished the biggest achievement in their life by being willing to sacrifice their own life. And then the Prophet explained that the biggest jihad is the struggle against your own desires and limitations.
Jihad does not mean holy war, primarily. The word means effort, striving, and it's always a hard struggle to put the word of God into practice.
Suicide bombing, things of that kind, they have no place in Islam. They must never have a place in Islam. Never. Never. Islam is really a soft thing. It's not a hard thing. And so we have to approach it with softness. And be soft to each other. Yassiru wa la tu'assiru, the Prophet said. Make it easy and not difficult. So we should put away all those angry words, the harsh and strident rhetoric that we've been dealing with for all these years, that we've suffered through this sweet religion with this beastly stuff. And come out into the light and be bright. Be bright in America. And look in the mirror. That's what we have to do. Assalamu alaikum. This piece is the golden rule of Islam. It is the basis of the relations between people. It means there is no harming of other people in Islam and no returning or retaliating harm for harm. And so that's why I did it, to respond through the sayings of Muhammad the man.
By the year 628, the battles that had occupied the Muslims for the preceding 4 years had come to an end.
Once the Muslims were no longer fearing the threat of total extermination, Muhammad knew that the time for fighting had stopped, and it was now time to make an extraordinary initiative, a peaceful, non-violent initiative. He astonished the whole Muslim community and the whole community of Yathrib by announcing that he was going to go on the Hajj pilgrimage. Dangerous as it was and enormously risky as it was, about 1,000 Muslims volunteered to go with Muhammad. All the rites were fulfilled to the letter. The camels all decked in their special sacrificial garments, the men all in their white garb.
The Muslims set out on the perilous trip to Mecca, crossing the vast desert without any arms to defend themselves. When they reached Hudaybiyah, just outside the sacred area around Mecca where violence was forbidden, Muhammad surprised his followers by ordering them not to enter, but to sit and wait. He then sent an emissary to Mecca seeking permission to complete the pilgrimage.
Muhammad knew, of course, that he was putting the people of Mecca into a really impossible position, because if they forbade Arabs to enter the city and perform the rites at the Kaaba, they would be abusing their position as guardians of the holy places. The Meccans themselves did not know what to do.
When the emissary did not return quickly, the Muslims feared the worst. But Muhammad's gambit paid off. The Meccans offered to negotiate a treaty. With tensions running high, Muhammad began dictating its first line by stating his own name.
Ali was taking down the notes with the Meccan negotiator at his side, and when Muhammad began saying, "The Prophet of God," the Meccan said, "I don't believe you're the Prophet of God. I can't sign to that."
So he said, "Fine, Muhammad, son of Abdullah." And many of the Muslims felt that this was a major insult.
The Muslims sitting round at Hudaybiyah watched this in utter dismay. There was almost a mutiny. 1,000 pilgrims stood refusing to accept this. Muhammad went back into his tent where he had his wife Salama, and he said to her, "What shall I do?" And she gave him some excellent advice. Part of the ritual of the Hajj was that you sacrifice a camel. And he went out and he sacrificed one of the camels, and somehow some kind of necessary tension was released.
The ritual sacrifice of an animal traditionally marked the end of the pilgrimage. Grudgingly, the Muslims considered the pilgrimage complete and headed back to Medina. Muhammad had compromised on every major point in the treaty, but he had won the most significant concession. In return for postponing their entry into Mecca for a year, the Muslims had secured 10 years of peace and official recognition as a political entity. Muhammad had proved himself as capable a diplomat as he was a religious leader.
There was wisdom in the treaty, because one of the things that was promised to the Muslims was protection as they moved throughout Arabia, that they would not be harmed, that they could move freely. And what was gained most greatly from that was the dawah, the teaching of al-Islam. On
the way back to Medina, Muhammad told his companion Omar, I have received a revelation which is dearer to me than anything else beneath the sun. It said, "Surely we have given you a clear victory."
Then more and more and more people came to Islam. More and more people turned to Muhammad. It sent out a huge signal of strength, strength of purpose, utter courage, utter panache, and utter wisdom. That, of course, you could go on to fight. Of course, he could have gone on being the prophet with the sword. But there are times when to make peace is more daring, more creative, and more enduring.
1 year after signing the Hudaybiyah Treaty, Muhammad led his followers on a new pilgrimage to Mecca. After years of rejection, persecution, and humiliation, this was truly a moment of triumph.
The first pilgrimage of the Muslims after Hudaybiyah must have been an extraordinary event for everybody, because the Meccans couldn't bear it. They decamped and went and sat up in the hills and mountains outside the city and watched this procession, huge procession of Muslims and some of their confederates coming on the Hajj, and as it were taking possession of the city, crying out the pilgrim cry, "Here I am, O God, here I come," in a huge cry.
Then came the moment Muhammad had waited 7 long years to achieve.
Muhammad sends Bilal, an African ex-slave, this lowest of the low in the eyes of the Meccans, up onto the sacred shrine of the Kaaba, what the Meccans regard as their shrine, to deliver the call to prayer. And the hills around Mecca are granite. They're set up for a sonorous voice. And the call to prayer resonates through the valley.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Bilal was proclaiming for all to hear, "There is one God, and Muhammad is his prophet."
It must have been an appalling moment for the Meccans, but an extraordinary moment of exhilaration for the Muslims, performing all the rites punctiliously and then taking no advantage of this, going back peacefully home.
But the peace between the Muslims and the people of Mecca would not last. By the end of the year, the Meccans had broken the Treaty of Hudaybiyah by attacking a clan allied with Muhammad. In response, 10 days into the holy month of Ramadan, Muhammad and a Muslim army of 10,000 men set out to take Mecca by force.
The Prophet felt he was strong enough to be able to conquer Mecca. But as the army approached the city, more and more leaders of the Quraysh realized that they were not going to win, and so many decided to join Islam. The Prophet entered the city without resistance.
When he came into Mecca, he came in with his head bowed down. He did not come in as an arrogant, conquering warrior. He comes in humbled by a victory that he sees is from God.
After circling the Kaaba 7 times, Muhammad destroyed each of the 360 idols that surrounded it. He then turned to the vanquished Meccans who had sought refuge inside the shrine, his own brethren who had oppressed and attacked the Muslims for so many years.
He says, "If you were in my position right now, what do you think you would do?" And the Meccans are afraid they're about to die. And then he says, "You are all pardoned." he grants them all amnesty. And this was unheard of in this culture, unheard of in this society, and very unexpected among the Meccans.
The religion that had begun in ridicule and persecution was now thriving throughout the Arabian Peninsula. But shortly after returning to Medina, Muhammad received a premonition of his death. He told his daughter, Fatima, that every year during Ramadan, the angel Gabriel recited the Quran to him and asked him to repeat it. This year, Gabriel had asked Muhammad to recite the Quran twice. "I cannot but think," Muhammad said, "that my time has come." In February 632, Muhammad made what would be his final pilgrimage to the city of his birth. On his first pilgrimage, he had led a few hundred Muslims back to Mecca. This time, tens of thousands of believers followed in his footsteps.
He arrives in Mecca as the leader of the Muslim people now, not as the enemy of the Meccans. And they begin to perform the rites of the pilgrimage. And during this period, Muhammad defines the rites of pilgrimage as they're performed today.
Michael Wolff has written extensively about the Hajj, the traditional pilgrimage which every Muslim is expected to perform at least once. 2 to 3 million Muslims from around the world travel to Mecca every year for this 5-day ritual, which takes them in the footsteps of Abraham, the ancient patriarch from whom Muslims, Jews, and Christians all trace their lineage. In 1990, Wolff, a convert to Islam, took part in his first Hajj.
The Hajj was one of the most attractive elements in Islam to me as a non-Muslim and then as a Muslim. When I finally became a Muslim after 20 or more years of thinking it over, the first thing I wanted to do was make the Hajj. When I circled the Kaaba for the first time, I was in a state of wonder. You're there with tens of thousands of people all doing the same thing at once. You're literally putting God at the center of your life for that period of time.
At the culmination of the Hajj, on the plain of Arafat, on a small hill called the Mount of Mercy, Muhammad gave his final sermon.
Here is a man who began his mission as this individual in Mecca, persecuted with almost no followers, and his life is completed with a valley filled with tens of thousands of people that have accepted his message, and there he is preaching to them his final sermon, and in it, in a sense, is a summation of this universal teaching.
He tells them to be good to each other and not to violate each other's rights, for men and women to treat each other humanely, for brothers and sisters to treat each other well, and for Muslims to treat each other as brothers and sisters. And perhaps most importantly, he calls an end to revenge, to blood killing, to the vendetta, which has bled this culture terribly since he was born. At the end of Muhammad's sermon, he does not list his achievements. This man has unified people. He has taught them monotheism. He has brought them to peace. And yet he doesn't mark these as his accomplishments. Quite the opposite. He asks his community, have I fulfilled my mission to my God? and to you. You can hear in his words the desire for a completed mission. This is a man of faith who is unsure of his effects. There's a very human moment in which he needs to know and he asks. And the people affirm that yes. 3 times they say, yes, you have fulfilled your mission.
This was not a leader who was looking for his legacy in time. It wasn't for any purpose other than to make sure that when he was going to face his maker, he was going to be accountable. And he would be in a position of saying, Allah, I did the best I could, and I hope I was successful in doing it. And that's all we can do as human beings.
Muhammad had been feeling ill. He'd had some fever. It was clear that he was in real difficulty in terms of his health. And the household seemed to be convinced that Muhammad was dying.
And while he was on his deathbed, and there were many who surrounded him, especially his close companions and his family, he called for silence around him. And he wanted it to be a time of quiet and of peace and of calm.
Embraced by the community he had founded in Medina and cared for by his wives and companions, Muhammad died peacefully on June 8th in the year 632. The news of his death shocked his followers, especially Omar, who believed Muhammad would outlive them all.
People began to hear, Prophet is dead. Omar went to the center square and started to say, there are hypocrites and liars who are saying that the Prophet is dead.
In the midst of this chaos, Abu Bakr reminded the Muslims of a verse from the Quran that had first been revealed after the Battle of Uhud, when they feared that Muhammad had been killed.
Abu Bakr comes into this scene of pandemonium, and he immediately stands up and says, whoever worshipped Muhammad, then know that Muhammad is dead. But whoever worshipped God, know that God lives on and never dies. And so suddenly these people are brought to their senses that indeed that Muhammad is a man, and men are mortal. And this is his legacy. He did everything within his power to prevent himself from being worshipped, because he recognized that that was a danger inherent in religious tradition, that the object of worship becomes the messenger and not the one sending the message.
Prophet Muhammad was a man, he's flesh and blood, who brought one of the most eloquent revelations to mankind. He's set an example to mankind through his behavior, through his actions, a living example. This is a legacy that he's left for Muslims.
Muhammad's legacy is obviously the seed that he planted. It is his righteousness, his honesty, his integrity, his model as a political leader, his model as an individual, a man who has made great accomplishments in his time, and yet who didn't let the successes overpower him, didn't let his ego get the best of him. He remains, I think, more than anything else, a great role model.
Muhammad is the kind of person who combines political and military and social and religious and intellectual dimensions of life in ways that are important for those of us in the 21st century who are struggling to put together complete lives ourselves.
If I were to have met Prophet Muhammad on the street, I feel like I would know him, and as though he would know all of us. The beauty of it is we live our lives through his examples, but he's not God. Our reverence is to God. and our reference is to him. So how I walk and how I speak and how I carry myself and how I treat my husband and how I treat my mother and my father and how I behave as a sister and a daughter and a nurse and a friend and a neighbor, that's all Prophet Muhammad in action.
There's more about Muhammad and his legacy on PBS Online. Experience a virtual pilgrimage to Mecca, read essays by people from the program, and much more. Visit PBS Online at pbs.org. To purchase a video cassette of Muhammad or a DVD with additional features, call 888-786-0444. Major funding for Muhammad, Legacy of a Prophet, has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, Arabian Bulk Trade, Sabadia Family Foundation, the El Hibri Foundation, the Irfan Katwari Foundation, and Mir Imran. Additional funding has been provided by many other organizations and individuals.
This is PBS.